Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 9 Bedford Row International Criminal Law series of lectures, another in our series during the pandemic, designed to keep us all together, designed to bring interesting subjects into debate. Tonight, I'm very pleased to have Professor Eric Shepherd, a very distinguished analyst of interviewing witnesses. That's the subject for tonight. Eric is a chartered psychologist, chartered scientist, and professor of investigative and security and police sciences at the City University London. He is a former advisor to the City of London Police. If I put it that he was very, very influential in the development of the recorded interview and interviewing techniques of witnesses, that would be an understatement. He's had a long and distinguished career since the mid-1980s, advising police and security forces on correct and appropriate interviewing techniques. In the UK, he was involved in a number of miscarriage of justice review cases. And in my particular case, I deployed him as an expert witness in the Kenyatta case at the International Criminal Court, because I was concerned about the quality of witness interviews that I had read. And I believed that the court required an expert witness to advise the court on how to approach and regard the quality of the evidence that had been produced in the OTP interviews. Needless to say, the prosecutor declined to be involved in such an exercise, but the report that was produced to me at the end by Professor Shepherd was in fact a very damning indictment of what had taken place. We'll get to that later. For the moment, that's enough of me. And I'd like to have you just give us a brief resume of your career, Eric, so that you can tell us how important it was that psychology was regarded as an integral part of the interviewing of witnesses and the techniques that should be appropriately applied. How did you become involved in such a subject?
Well, it could take about an hour to do that, but I'll try to do it as briefly as possible. I think, like so many things, Stephen, things happen by accident. For my sins, I started off life working for Her Majesty as a Royal Marine, and I found myself in Southern Arabia at the time of end of empire and Aden, and clearly the issue then, it became a tribal war, and then it became a terrorist situation. And as history was repeating itself, as it had in Kenya and in Cyprus, what actually happened was the knee-jerk reaction from, say, historically, from the British perspective, was to have an interrogation centre. And so I happened to speak Arabic by some rather kind of contorted means and so on. So indeed, what actually happened was, as more and more members of the indigenous special branch were murdered, their sources and things like that, life became, in the terrorist setting, more and more difficult in terms of questioning terrorists. So it was cutting one's teeth in an interrogation context and so on. So when I came back to UK, the logical thing was to continue in that vein as I had. So I transferred out of the Royal Marines into that part of the British Army which is called the Intelligence Corps. And the Intelligence Corps covers a whole spectrum of intelligence and security work, but one aspect of that is training interrogators and training people to resist interrogation. So that occupied a fair amount of my time. I was also deployed in a special forces kind of context where we're in, say, war situations and so on. Again, one has to look at the period of the 70s and so on across the world. Then, in fact, again, interrogation came to the fore, and clearly testimony given for operational commanders to make decisions. So I then asked if I had to wait to go to staff college. Again, another accident. Too many people in my age bracket. So I asked if I could read a psychology degree and go and look at the psychology of interrogation. And so I did. I managed to pull that off. Came back to UK, studied a straightforward psychology degree. At the same time, I qualified clinically, and so and because there were highly vetted people who needed things in kind of less than happy circumstances, so I then qualified as a psychotherapist, and I began to see that in fact the whole issue of disclosure really was needed to be thought through just a bit more than one had actually done for the previous decades or so. So I qualified as a psychotherapist, and then I found that in fact so much in the clinical world informed about what it was to really listen and to, in fact, fundamentally, the key to the whole thing is respect for a person, respect for their rights as equal to one's own. And so I eventually retired at my own request, and in 1980 started working within the UK police context with the Metropolitan Police. And 40 years later, last March at COVID, I finished my last training course of detectives in interviewing. And that journey has really been paralleled by clinical work and also analyses for both the defense and indeed for the prosecution in lower court and upper court and outside UK as well. And that's really it. It's kind of, it's been a full time really.
Yes.
Never dreamed when I was that age in 1963, 64, that in fact, questioning and how one dealt with it be the core of my life. It was just an accident.
So I remember being a young lawyer, as I was once a young lawyer, Eric, in the late 70s and early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And we had obviously issues in our justice system about the quality of certain police interviews. In fact, I remember when training, the part of our course at bar school included verbals, and that was where there were false verbal confessions. And we went through a series of quite big challenges to the quality of the police interviews that were happening. And eventually we had our Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which provided standards for the recording of interviews, as well as the procedures that could be applied to interviews, which in a sense revolutionized the acceptance of police interviews into our criminal court proceedings. Now, taking that time at the early 80s, would you agree it was necessary to have the Police and Criminal Evidence Act within our system at that time?
Yeah, I think the Police and Criminal Evidence Act that I think you've highlighted there, and it's so apt, Stephen, that you mentioned that time when you were a young lawyer and in the 70s. You may well remember the case of, in 1972, of the murder of Maxwell Comfey in Doggett Road in Catford in Kent. And what you can say is that Lattimore was an 18-year-old man with in those days they used to measure intellectual functioning in terms of mental age, and he had a mental age of a 9-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, and two teenagers, one of whom was Turkish in origin and so on. And they were induced to make confessions. And that led eventually to an inquiry, and then that was fed in, as you quite indicated there, to the Police and Criminal Evidence Act via the Royal Commission on Criminal Procedure. And very few people, I found myself a couple of years back giving a lecture in Switzerland at Lausanne, and talking about incredible journey. And the incredible journey in your lifetime and mine, I don't want to sound like two old men here, but that incredible journey from the 70s through to the 80s and the 90s and up to now has been, yes, truly incredible. And what really strikes me is how hard won it was, and how risky, and how almost by more luck than judgment. Like, for instance, the recording you mentioned there of, that's inherent in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, but right down to the wire, it was still being discussed and kicked around. And should it just be for when the person made their confession, just like happens in America and over the years? And so from my point of view, recording was touch and go, really. Experiments were done, as it were. And in the 1980s, clearly, there were 4 police forces that tried out recording for the Home Office experiments. And it was going to be thumbs down until such time as across in Scotland, they also had recording which highlighted corrupt and improper behaviour by police officers there that would take people for long drives, bring them back into the police station, and they make a confession in 10 minutes. So the thing that really strikes me is it was a wonderful piece of legislation, PACE. It focused, and quite rightly, minds on suspects. And it took a decade of back and forth, and a serious crime squad having to be disbanded in the West Midlands for its even misconduct, even with recording. But the important issue for me is nothing was ever brought to the fore about witness interviewing. And that's really strange, because it's quite right to record suspect interviews, but I think the elephant in the room, to use a cliche, has been witness interviewing. And that is the case in all jurisdictions that I've worked in. That in fact, because the generality of witness interviewing is never recorded, it means that police officers can be subject to all sorts of information processing and bias in the way that they handle information. And so what you get are written statements which are drafted by police officers, and indeed do not give an accurate account of what this individual said, and all sorts of devices. They're human beings, investigators, but clearly misconduct, whether for whatever reason, it's depressing. And I still think we struggle with the generality of witness interviews in the UK. We have vulnerable, intimidated, and special witnesses, and recording of that will be, yes, absolutely so. For vulnerable people on achieving best evidence, wonderful. But the important issue is, with witness interviews, if they're not recorded, then also if there's no audit trail of the conversation that happens before the interview ever takes place, or what happens after the interview, you get situations, even most recently, it's dated, but if you say take the Lockerbie bombing, Megrahi, the guy who eventually never got an appeal but was released to go back to Libya and died of pancreatic cancer, he had an appeal on the chops. The key witness in the Lockerbie case was a shopkeeper in Malta. He was interviewed 20 plus times and gave 7 versions of what happened. And it evolved across time. And of course, really trying to put that together was incredibly difficult because you couldn't find the audit trail. And I dwell upon this, Stephen, but I have a bee in my bonnet now after all these years that unless we get witness interviewing right, suspect interviewing can never really progress. But that's a rather positive view, I suppose.
No, we're going to turn now to the international context, having taken it through the UK, and we're going to look now at the witness interviews and why it's important to consider the matters that you've raised so far, Eric. Let's just turn to the changing of accounts, 7 different accounts given by a witness in 20 interviews. What does that indicate to you as a psychologist, the changing accounts?
Well, I think the issue for me is that if you look at an individual who's disclosing on a matter, then clearly we're all liable and prone, and it's human for us to change our accounts to actually, as greater remembrance happens. But there are absolutely fundamental, almost commonsensical ways of looking at things that if a person gives an odd or an unexpected content in their disclosure, in their response, if it's a contradictory aversion to what was said before, then an alarm bell should ring. If it's inconsistent, if what they say now cannot coexist with something they said earlier, rather than contradict, they just can't live together, it's inconsistent, it should ring an alarm bell. If a person gives an account that in its various stages is not so much detail, highly detailed, not so much detailed, a bit more detail, I call that narrative contrast. That should ring an alarm bell. If they talk nonsense, if their representation of something is illogical, it's counter to physical reality, that should ring an alarm bell. If they give something which is absurd reasoning, it should ring an alarm bell. If it's gibberish, if they have shredded thoughts of it, it should be ringing an alarm bell. If it's a pat account, if they give an account that's so unusually chronological in its sequence that in fact you might say, gosh, that must have been learned to have that, because most human beings aren't able to give accounts that are perfectly chronological, apart from barristers and judges and things like that, because that's your life, as it were. With judges telling you off as young counsel, would you like to express that again? But the important issue for me is all of those things ring alarm bells. And if there are many other forms of anomaly that something that you expect to be mentioned isn't mentioned. That's a non-barking dog, Sherlock Holmes, Silver Blaze wise. Why didn't they mention it? If they basically, to me, give an account that says, shall we think about this? And I think, interestingly, that demands thought. And I think a lot of, I'd say, investigators, a lot of prosecutors, and God bless them, a lot of judges are subject to what I call a kind of conviction psychology. And conviction psychology has it's a 2 play on words here. As human beings, we are predisposed to think that what we believe is right. So that consciously, unconsciously, and in the margins of conscience, we will be picking up things that confirm what we believe. And I think investigators and prosecutors are very prone to this biased way, distorted way of understanding the world. It's very human, but actually the job of the defense, as I see it, is to be the watchdogs, to be the quality control of distorted thinking that's actually convincing what they believe, and also convinced that they should go for conviction. So that's why I call it conviction psychology.
Yeah, I've often used an expression when dealing with a witness that's changed his or her story on more than one occasion, is that if they'd been an eyewitness to the event, they would have been remembering what they saw. But if they've told a lie initially, they would be trying to remember what they've said before. And gentle probing of that lie brings about the conflict and the contrast in story. Would that be something that resonated with you?
Yes, indeed. I think you tread on extremely challenging territory when you do that. And I think the way you described is a really commonsensical way of handling it. Human beings, by their very nature, are quite narrow in their attention. So their attentional focus is narrow. And the issue for me is that they take information in from the environment, it goes into their working memory, but they're constantly editing that. And so it enters intermediate memory and it goes into what would be their longer term memory. Now, there are all sorts of influences that happen there, such that a person, when they are asked to disclose what happens subsequently, either soon after or later at trial, then the important issue at that stage is they will certainly have to harken back to what they thought they said earlier, and then any kind of subsequent telling in between. So clearly, whatever they said earlier may actually in itself not entirely fit with what they say at court. And it's a very difficult judgment piece to actually say, right, to what extent do you give a person leeway for saying, say, a year has intervened between the two? But what we do know is what influences occurred around that time when they were giving their disclosure, putting it together. So clearly, they're the influences that you as a lawyer, myself as a forensic psychologist, are really interested in saying what affected their initial account to themselves and then the ones they gave to others. I tell you, Stephen, the thing that really still perplexes me, and when I'm training detectives, I raise the point how infrequently police officers and investigators ever ask a person the journey of their remembrance that you've just mentioned there. Who did they speak to? Who have they spoken to? And the important issue is that from the very moment at the beginning, when the incident happens, there are influences about those people who were there at the scene. They will have all perceived something differently, and no two people will see exactly the same thing. But what often happens is people come up with a thing called consensus memory. So they agree. So if one of them says, do you remember that guy? He had that buckskin jacket with the tassels. Oh, yes. Yeah. And then that gets incorporated into someone's account. And then clearly later, a year later, you have the awful task, an awesome task of disentangling where did that come from, And the other issue is, to me, is that what often happens is the accounts that enter the criminal justice system, witness accounts, written statements, are never accurate representations of what the person actually said. They're selectively edited by the police officer who created the MG11. So later at trial, when a witness is in the witness box and you are doing your job and colleagues like you are doing your job of trying to cross-examine, then they may very well have said, the witness, to the police officer something, but it never got into the statement. So that then seems to me to be like, it could appear as additional detail or detail that actually contradicts what, say, the police officer wrote. I don't want to sound hypercritical, but it's that journey of an account that really, again, coming back to the defense, I think we are watchdogs of what is police conduct and cognition, the way they think.
How important is it then for an investigator to put together information about the contact that a witness has had, maybe with other witnesses, with other investigators, their journey, as you called it? How important is that, or should that be, for the record of what the witness produces as evidence?
Well, I can take it in a national context and I can take it in the international context. Do you remember in the, I don't want to leap forward and put you out of sequence or whatever, but do you remember the character that in the Kenyatta case, he clearly was what I would call a brokered witness. Someone was acting as a broker of witnesses, and he clearly had contact with him. It was incumbent upon the OTP investigators to establish what was his history of contact with the person who brokered him as a witness. Exactly the same in a national context. You have to really turn around and say, in a very gentle way, and establish it in a very socially skilled way, but why is this person saying this now in this way? And behind everything is a history. So much so, the other day you were very tolerant with me. I've started to write now about the contact that people have before they ever ask questions in a formal sense, because I think that is hugely influencing of an individual. And there are huge cultural differences as well in this. Some cultures are more compliant than others and so on. But what is the case is that in even the UK context, if a witness has been speaking with a relative, friend, or a helping professional and so on, and that's much more salient in some cases, as it were. So what will happen is you've already got an account that itself has evolved. It's the nature of human memory that it's a reconstruction process. We never, ever replicate what actually happened. We are constantly reconstructing. If you ask me, our times when we last met and so on, physically, then I would have to reconstruct that. And one of the things we do know is that reconstruction process is in itself subject to bias. We will tend to have a confirmation memory. We will tend to say to ourselves again and again, something which may not have been the case. And certainly in America, a lot of research into witness testimony has shown that people who are quite honest will remember things that never ever happened. But I don't want to drift away too much, but and forgive me if I have. What really strikes me is it's incumbent upon all of us in the criminal justice system, national and international, to say, what journey did this scrap of humanity travel, and how did this account actually get told, get reconstituted, repeated again, and so on? So I whittled on, but that's the main thrust of what I'm trying to say, I suppose.
I can see from our list of people in front of us that we've got a really international audience here, Eric. So we'll keep on the international if we may.
Yes.
And we'll just look at that particular ICC case, and we'll take that one witness. Now, that was a recorded interview. So there were tape recordings, and as I recollect, I gave you the transcripts and indeed got the original tapes eventually for you to go through and analyze. What was the quality of interviewing that you saw in that interview, and what was, by any shred of imagination, a witness who was key to the indictment, if not the indictment?
Well, I thought, when you gave me the material, that there were some 20 odd interviews. Eventually, I think they produced another 4. So the thing that I asked myself was, okay, who are the people conducting these interviews? And you again provided me and assisted me in finding out. I did my own research as well. So what you had was, you had prosecutors, you had counsel, but you also had investigators, the investigators of the OTP, who came from various nations. So you had a British guy who'd been through and trained in the UK peace model, which is represented to be how you should do it, the proper way of doing this. You had a German who was the lead investigator. And what really strikes me was I was expecting, before I ever looked or listened to the recordings, that these would be done properly, that these would be a la the English way of doing things, the German way, and there's a way of doing it in Scandinavia. So if I take it slightly afield, Scandinavian investigators also bring to the fore in their investigations what's called their creative for the letters, to do with communication and ethics. But the thing that really astounded me, Stephen, was that was when I looked at, firstly, the numbers of people who were interviewing. So there was the witness, and what actually happened was that you would have, as a common denominator, 3 or 4 interviewers, and sometimes 5. So what really struck me was how unusual it was to have one witness surrounded, even though I had the audio tapes, surrounded by voices, all asking questions. Now, typically there would be a lead interviewer, a lead investigator, but there was certainly instance, and in my report where I drew to your attention, was the fact it was a free-for-all. The other thing which was extraordinary was the extent to which not only was it a free-for-all, but in fact the number of topic changes when you move from one topic to another. What is trained within the proper way of doing things, the ethical, the sensible way of doing things is if you take a person from one topic to another, you should logically connect to the next bit and the next bit and the next bit. That's a managed interview. So what actually happened was this witness, I think in one instance, had 23 different topics in one interview. Now, any human being in an interview that changes fundamentally 23 times is insane. You have to empathize with the person you're wishing to give an account. And it makes no sense or whatever if the people asking questions jump from one topic to another. But what it did reveal was not only were these interviews relatively lengthy and bizarre in the way I've described, but it was quite apparent that because they followed very closely in sequence, there was absolutely no evaluation within the interview of what he was saying, but certainly outside the interview of what he was saying. So the anomalies that I'm talking about, like talking complete illogical absurdities or contradictions, inconsistencies, which were glaring, but they seem to be totally ignored. And can I draw to those watching that, in fact, in one instance, this witness was talking about the alleged killing of his wife, and he gave 4 versions, none of which could coexist. And they just continued polling on as though nothing was really anything to bother about, as it were. So when you looked at it, the nature of the questioning, one questioner was quite considered, but the witness was clearly incapable of constructing a response that would make a sensible reply. So he kept on saying, what? And we're talking 90 odd times saying, what? And at that stage, no alarm bell rang. I mean, I found they were extraordinary interviews. And I think I haven't got a copy because I destroyed the report as I was bidden. So I'm a good chap. But I seem to remember my overall conclusion was that this was a compliant, inept liar. And it was pretty obvious. And that's not me bad-mouthing him. He was just inept. And he was an incompetent liar. But he was very compliant. And so that was obvious after 22 kind of exposures we said I'm driving at. And none of these investigators seem to bat an eyelid about it, as far as I can see.
Is it good enough for an investigator once he's bagged a point? And that's a phrase I've heard many times, as no doubt you have, that a point has been bagged in the questioning of an interview, so of a witness. So it's like ticking a box.
Yes.
Is that good enough to take the big point without examining where the witness has come from to make that statement? I.e., where were you? What were you doing, to examine it further?
I think you make an absolutely crystal point there, which I think is the case, that say it was apparent that people went into these interviews with what would be an agenda. They wanted things that they would tick off, that this person would give a reply. So long as that reply was sufficient into the moment, then they would move on. But they didn't actually stand back and see the context in which this individual was disclosing the actual entirety of the accounts that he would be giving, his manner of disclosure, which was really, really odd. And yet, what it is I think that, again, I don't want in any way to sound judgmental. I think what happens, and I can understand why, when there is a heinous or emotive crime that happens, and particularly in an international context like the ICC, then you've got what I would say key actors. In the case, Kenyatta would be a key actor. And so what people do from the prosecutor's perspective, as far as I can infer from what I saw in the way in which questioning went on, was that clearly there was a thing called tunnel vision. So the tunnel, it's a way of describing how you process information, how you engage investigative actions outside interviews, but also how you interview, which is you're going down a tunnel. And what you're really wanting to do is only focus on those responses that confirm your belief or what is the case. Come back to confirmation bias. So you would ask suggestive questions or leading or false option questions that would actually get this individual to give the response that you wanted. If in other questions, when the English trained interviewer asked open-ended questions, the witness was completely incapable of giving what I would call a free response to something. And the important issue there is that should have rung an enormous alarm bell. Of course, you can tick off responses of, I need to check this, I need to check that, where were the meetings, who did what, and so on. What you would call closed identificationary questions, who, what, where, when, these kinds of issues. But if you ask them to say, tell me about, then that requires that reconstruction memory you were talking about earlier, Stephen. And if this person has not been exposed to that reality, has never been there, never did it, and so on, then they are trying to make up something, as I said in my report, on the fly. They've got to make it up as they go along. That's a huge mental task. It's why human beings tend to be rather poor liars, is because if they say too much, then they're caught out. So the most common form of lying in life is just not to say. Most people think it's all about porky pies, but it isn't about porky pies. Most people in life lie by just not saying or speaking in generalities. If there's someone who's pressing for detail, then they're on the back foot. How do they cope with this? And that's what happened to the witness in the ICC case, was that he couldn't measure up. So when asked an open-ended question, he was unable to give a narrative. So he would go off at a tangent. And that's a very odd response, to be tangentially replying or diverting. Ask someone else about this, because I don't know. So when I look back at that case you very kindly brought to me to work on, I think it was absolutely classic. There are half a dozen odd responses to a request, just disclose detail. There are another half a dozen types of absences of detail. There are some half a dozen problems with content of responses. This witness had them all, which is quite odd when you come to think about it. So it was very easy, after all of 150 odd pages of reporting, looking at them, to come around and say he's a compliant, inept, incompetent liar. I mean, it's kind of it's obvious he couldn't give a coherent account.
So looking at these cases, Eric, some of them have a big time gap that are from the date of the events to the matter being investigated and questions being asked of a witness. What impact does time have on these matters? Can you give us a resume of that? How important is it to be near the time when the crimes were committed? What's the problem with time that has long passed?
I think what you're really asking me to do is to say, how does memory possibly change across time?
Yeah.
Or how does it remain stable? Okay, that's a really important question, because again, within national settings, but also in international settings like the ICC, where there will be years or whatever intervening, what we know about human memory is if something happens, say, to me today, I go down to the village of Enniskerry and there's an incident. And so what will happen is we'll go into my working memory, into my long-term memory, and every time I revisit it mentally, I think about what happened in Enniskerry today. I might mention it to Rosalie, my wife, or whatever. I might give an account to the guards, the police here. Then the important issue for me is that in some way will cement it in time. So it locks it there. But with progression of time, so when weeks go into months, months go into years, what happens with human memory is every time you revisit it, it's a reconstruction, but that revisiting is always increasingly imperfect. So what will happen is that, again, go back to the confirmation bias, we will tend to reconfirm in our awareness. We cast our mind back, say a year down the line, I should think about the incident in Enniskerry, and what will happen is across time, detail, fine-grained detail drops out, and some detail acquires extraordinary salience. If you cast your mind back, like myself, cast my mind back to getting married, on our wedding day, we will remember some things now all these years later, but we won't remember all the detail. And our remembrance of that detail will be imperfect. It's more salient. So when you interview someone after a passage of time, it's magic lamps need careful handling. They have to be rubbed the right way, because if you try to press too much for detail, what they will do is confabulate. They will try to fill in the gaps. And human beings are great confabulators. It's very normal human behavior. So when pressed for detail about something across time, then be prepared that an account given 2 years, 3 years, 5 years later will not be accurate. It can't be accurate. It will not be an accurate representation of what happened. And that's because of human frailty. Memory evolves. It makes the investigation of hugely emotive events very difficult. Going to the national context like sexual offending and so on, then what will happen is it's very difficult to talk about historic abuse. If you look at, say, something like a massacre or the use of rape as a weapon of war in situations, if we look at the saddest, most recent years of Rohingya, yes, what will happen when people try to reconstitute that is that there will be saliences, but once pressed for that, there will be a penumbra of detail that actually is very spongy. It's very difficult. So what needs to happen is for prosecutors, investigators, and clearly I keep on coming back, the defense, is to remind people of what is going on here. So I hope I made myself clear enough. Memory evolves. If I can round off, that's why if you look at, say, war crimes things following the Second World War, that when people have gone on trial in Germany and so on, it's been very difficult for people to give accounts of being in concentration camps about particular guards. It's the way memory changes.
Yeah, the first of our lecture series concentrated on the narrative, and in international cases, we're often dealing with narratives, the narratives of one side's view of a war, one side's view of what happened to them and how things happened in their area. What kind of, well, first of all, should an investigator questioning a witness check for such things over the influences upon the witness, what they've heard, what narrative they've heard?
Yes, I think it's particularly important. Again, do you remember a while back I was talking about when you interview any witness, you need to know the journey they've traveled before they start giving their account. And part of that is to find out what have they been exposed to. There is a thing called post-event information, PEI. PEI is any exposure to media, in particular, images, versions that are kind of given as official or not so official or whatever. The important issue is when people are exposed to that, they plug into that and they incorporate it into their own experience. So let me give you an example of post-event information. The death of Diana, Princess of Wales, and Dodi Al Fayed. So what then happens is what account could be given of by, say, her bodyguard if he had been, as he was, exposed to information about the white car, the headlamps, the paparazzi, and things like this. So I'm just using it as a rather low-key way of looking at things, but to try and reinforce what you're saying there, Stephen, that in fact, in an international context, what you need to know is, with this witness, why this witness, why now, what journey did they travel? What is their kind of exposure? And of course, you use this lovely turn of phrase, narrative. So your profession, and for many of those looking in here, is all about opposing narratives in court. So narratives, the nature of history is narratives, opposing narratives. And I think what then happens is, if you try to look at a narrative, you then have to turn around and say, whose narrative? Why is this narrative of this particular character? So people will give different narratives of events. So it's an interesting issue, because they're the difficult bits that matter so much in international investigations. They're the important bits that create, I think, the context in which this individual in the middle, the witness, has to be understood. So it seems to me to be, it's not an easy task, but it's a task where you have to say, those who investigate, those who are prosecutors, have to be very aware of their own biases, their own tunnel vision, and actually they're dealing with people who've got narratives that have to be researched before they even start disclosing.
I've got a case on at the moment which involves a couple of witnesses that were young children, 7, 8 at the time, of events that are now 20 years ago. And the claim is that they have witnessed certain events and put them into a context. What sort of examination should interviewers deploy when dealing with a witness who 20 years ago was, say, age 5, 6, or 7, has given almost a perfect context of events, and then is interviewed 10, 15 years later? What should interviewers do to get a reliable and honest account?
Well, again, that's not an easy question to answer, because there are so many things that contribute to it, to answer it adequately. What seems to me to be the case is, if a person's been, say, subjected to traumatic events that have involved them, that they've been the subject of abuse or they've observed things, whatever. So the question is, there is a debate. There's a huge debate within psychology as to how you manage this. And then, because psychologists are human beings themselves, they will necessarily gravitate to one way or the other. And you'll have seen these in trials you've been in. But the thing for me is, I think investigators do not actually access sufficient non-verbal experience from people they interview. We tend to think that interviewing is solely to do with the verbal realm. But the important issue is that if you wanted to validate something, if you wanted to say, right, okay, describe the room to me, the very best way you could describe an individual and get an individual to describe a room is to show you with their hands. I was involved in an appeal case here in Ireland in the early 90s, where an individual had been inappropriately treated when interrogated. and he was able, with his hands, to describe the room in which he was abused. And he was able to say, well, I came in the room and there was a table around him. He moved his hand around like that. Yeah, and there was this table. He doesn't say the words, but you know the table was round. And it was, it's just, and he indicated height. So these hand movements are called illustrators. What very few and hopefully increasingly investigators should do is get people to show you with their hand. What was the layout of the bedroom? Close your eyes and show me with your finger, well, the door swung in and the bed was over here and there was a window there. And there was something, I don't quite know what it was, but it was about this. You see the point I'm making? So these illustrators are hugely validating of what they're describing. They're above and beyond the world of words. So the problem when you're getting someone to tell you something which happened years ago, I'm 77 now, and if you ask me to describe, say, something which would be, say, prep school when I was a 7-year-old, yeah, I can still, with my eyes closed, describe the lower floor, the upper floor, the dormitories and things like that. But I could show you with my hands, Stephen. I wouldn't need the words and so on. And what is kind of a debate at the moment is when people are giving accounts of something that happened repeatedly, it creates something called script memory. If we're all adults, say an individual is the subject of anal assault repeatedly, but then the important issue there is that that individual may not be able to describe any one instance, but they might be able to describe the locker room in which it happened. They might, you see the point I'm making, because it's become what, if something gets repeated, it becomes what is called a script memory. It's become a normality. I can remember a case again in the military of an NCO who sexually abused his child from the age of 4 all the way through to her late teens. And this poor lass couldn't describe any particular instance as they were moving around Germany and things like that. But the one thing she could describe was the first time. And the one thing she could describe was, so often it's the first one or it might be the last one. Do you see the point I'm making? So you use these kinds of anchors. But normally it's kind of, you'd be a bit kind of chary about having someone who's describing something in so much minute detail that it was point to point, you see what I'm driving at. So a lot of human experience will have that fuzziness because life has evolved in the way that, there are kind of islands of remembrance and so on, and some detail will drop out. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, the things that I've always looked out for, because the event itself and what happened, as you said, can often be spoken of in one or two sentences. But when you get a context, your alarms go up as to where that context came from.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
What is behind the context, because with youngsters and being asked to give or remember events several years later can be subject to influences, as we know, and that's the thing we've got to guard against. Should interviewers be looking for that kind of thing? Should they be, if it comes up with too much detail and context, is it right that the interviewer tries to get to the truth?
You ask hard questions. You're a very good lawyer. The thing for me, I suppose, really, you put your finger right on what is the heart of everything, whether it be in the ICC context, whether it be in witness interviewing generally, but this kind of, you have to see the context. That lovely context comes from, you're a Latinist as well, comes with, cum, and texture, which means to weave. So when people give an account, it is woven into something which gave birth to that account, in which it emerged. So a very kind of straightforward thing one would do if someone comes forward and alleges something happening now is to establish why now? Why come forward now? You know, and again, it's a hackneyed way of looking at things, but has this person gone through a period of distress? Are they in therapy or counseling? This kind of issue? Are they needing of attention? I'm not saying any of these things necessarily apply, but it would be foolish and immoral and wrong in the extreme if you and I in our respective professions didn't ask these questions, which is why this, why now, and why this detail? I can remember once being in a case where someone was giving hugely detailed account of going way back to when they were about 3. Now, that's very challenging. Human beings don't start developing and entering adult language until about 2.5. Before then, they had their own proto-language, Babel, and things like that. So the interesting thing is, the further you go back in time, as soon as you hit the fact that people are verbalizing something at a time when they didn't have language, then that must be an alarm bell. I mean, it must be. By its very nature, you then have to say, right, what age does this remembrance, date stamp emerge? What context did it happen? And cast forward in time to the moment now as to why is it occurring now? I thought classically, you remember the Henriquez report about Nick? Even now, I just shake my head at the fact of how completely devoid of any kind of sensible contextual questioning about this individual and his responses. He reminded me, the bits I saw in the public domain about him, of our witness in Kenya. Obviously he couldn't measure up to some things. I mean, it's incredible. Sorry, after you.
Yeah, Nick was the witness, for those who may not know, who made the allegations about British politicians, Field Marshal Bramall, being involved in sexual acts against him over many years whilst he was in a care home, all of which was Leon Britton died, a number of others have died, and their families had to live with these allegations. And he was making allegations he was abused by prominent politicians and people in political and public life that was simply born of fantasy. And there was no investigation of those claims for independent markers. How important is that, Eric?
Well, I think very much, and thank you for summarizing that, because I think, again, we keep on coming back to the fact that no one seemed to ask the contextual questions about Nick. Why was he saying it now in the way he did? And in fact, some of the descriptions that he had were actually very quickly beggaring belief. They were illogical representations, and they were absurd in the extreme. And the interesting thing is almost, it's a classic example of tunnel vision again. The tunnel vision that wraps around the accounts that he was given is that, again, there is this notion about confirmation bias. If you are disposed to believe something, every little shred that emerges, you will selectively attend to and say that that buttresses what you already know. and it's called hindsight bias. So the more bits of detail that emerge that you selectively attend to, you then have this process of investigators saying, I knew it all along, you see, I told you so. And that's the outcome of what's called hindsight bias. That's a historical run of confirmatory biased questioning and responses, which actually feed back and create a fantasy into what is now, we now know, was a totally moonshine kind of way of looking at things. It rather like the guy in the ICC in Kenya. I mean, what he described was clearly just not the case and couldn't have been. And so, as I cited earlier, him describing the movements and the people involved, the vehicles, the locations with the death of his wife, was almost reminiscent when I watched Nick of a guy just giving accounts that none of them really would converge. And yet, the senior police officer went on television and said, I believe him to be a true and credible witness. Well, there you are. That's kind of tunnel vision.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the international case, I'm going to slightly change track because you mentioned our Kenya case. How important is it to understand the culture of the witness, and even for that matter, the interpreter, if an interpreter's being used? How important is such detail in getting an accurate interview?
Right. Well, there are two things. Let's start with the cultural issue, and then I'll talk about interpreting, about which I have a bee in my bonnet amongst so many others. Okay, let's take the cultural context. Linguists and social psychologists talk, again, this word is very heavily used, context, but they talk about high context cultures and low context cultures. High context cultures tend to be cultures which tend to be rather hierarchical, or there is a positional way of the world. And I'm talking about, say, the Far East, Japan, Korea, certainly coming forward to India, but through Malaysia, these kind of issues and so on. So, and into Africa. And also across the world into South America and Latin America. So what you've got is in society there is a positional kind of thing. People have positions within families and within, obviously, a society. So what then happens is there's a lot attached to face and a lot attached to face saving. So what will happen is people will tend not to say or not to say a lot. And the important issue is if you ask them to say something and they pick up from your questioning, which might be leading or false option type things, that you are suggesting what they should say, they'll say it. They won't defer, so they won't dissent. So very, very much in high context cultures like that, you have a high incidence of what is called acquiescent and compliant responding. Acquiescent responders say yes to everything, unreflectively. So they're easily caught out. You just have to ask the last question you asked the other way around. And if they say yes to that, then they're nonsensically replying. They're easily detected. But again, not many investigators actually detect acquiescent responding. They actually capitalize on it. They just get the person to agree. A compliant responder is not unreflectively agreeing. They're agreeing because they want to remain in the good books and they have the approval and have their face saved, as it were, relative to this person. So in high context cultures, there's a huge risk of acquiescent responding and compliant responding. In low context cultures, which would be Western Europe and North America, particularly as society moves on, people are much more kind of questioning, then they are likely to be much less compliant these days than, say, when you were talking as a younger barrister in the 70s and into the 80s. It was a different world then. People were much more, it was a prefectorial system, authority type things. So the police would capitalize on that. They would actually have people who were compliant and responding, and many of the miscarriages of justice in the 80s and the 70s were born of that. Much less so now, because it doesn't get capitalized upon in interviews. So I think context in terms of acquiescence and compliance through to deferential kinds of ways of doing it, positional cultures. So you definitely need, if you're an investigator working for the OTP, to know this. But also if you're a defense lawyer wanting to get your own witnesses, we're all as much victim to that as well. The bee in my bonnet I've got about interpreters is because the general standard of interpreting across the world is rubbish. And I mean that very strongly, because in my life I've interpreted for people. And if you find you're in an interpreting situation, you definitely need to check out the interpreter, find out, again, their context and their origins, but then you will always know the hallmark of a professional interpreter vis-a-vis someone who isn't. And it's all about a thing called the direct approach and the indirect approach. Professional interpreters say exactly in the target language what this person has said. So if you were, say, interviewing someone here who was, say, a Yemeni Arab, and I was the interpreter, and if you said, tell me what happened last night, I would just say, tell me what happened last night in Arabic. And if he says, well, I got up late, I've been sleeping in the afternoon, I went out and had a meeting with. So what I would say is, I got up late, I've been sleeping in the afternoon. You see, I'd say exactly what he said. That's called direct interpreting. It's voicing exactly what you say, what he says. Indirect approach is me, when he talks, to say something like that. He said he got up and he went downtown. Have you noticed that I said he got up and he said he went downtown? What I've done is I've edited out a lot of what he said. So indirect interpreting is absolutely chock full of editing by interpreters. And that's revealed, I found in the UK context as much as others, when it's contested that there's an interpreter in an interview, and the defense quite rightly question the accuracy of what has been said. And so I think interpreting, if a person is indirect interpreting, you'll always know, like he said or she said, that they're editing.
Yeah, so interpreters can play a crucial role in a
Yes.
Interview, as we know, because they're the medium by which the questioners ask questions. Those interpreters that are used, should you have them that are familiar with the culture of the witness? How independent should the interpreter? Because what I've noticed is sometimes you get sides, so you get an interpreter who's from the same political perspective as the witness, and that then leads down a path of perhaps a context that is not wrong, or unreliable evidence, is the way I'll express it.
I think you're right. I think, again, for anyone who's looking in, as I said to you when we were discussing this event, I'm more than happy if anyone wants to contact me to send them material on how they could brief interpreters, check out their kind of credentials and things like that, their suitability. And one of those things you check out is things like ethnicity, their tribes and things like this. Like for instance, again, because it's kind of a thing which much of my life has been occupied within an Arab setting, is that I can remember an instance where an interpreter in Arabic had absolutely no awareness of what would be the Arabian Peninsula. And so this was an individual who was being questioned from Aden, but the interpreter was from the Maghreb, from Morocco. And they are completely different kind of contexts. You will have standard Arabic and so on, but the guy from the Arabian Peninsula was as different as chalk and cheese to this individual from the Maghreb. And so the important issue for me, I suppose, really is that, yeah, that matters. I think tribes matter. That is interesting. Go back to the Kenyan case. You and I know, and it was just a quirk of fate, I'd actually happened, I think I told you, to have served in Kenya as a special branch officer many years before, at the time of Uhuru, the independence, and was very aware of the tribal kind of issues and so on. But if you take, say, tribes from the Rift Valley, they are incredibly different to people who may come from main town Nairobi and things like that. So that's really important to know those kinds of issues. Also, if you've got someone who pops up to act as an interpreter who is not what I would call a bona fide interpreter, but someone is there by happenstance, you definitely need to check out why this person, why now, why are they doing it? Don't you think I'm a suspicious fellow?
Yeah. No, well, what about using relatives as interpreters? Because that's what I've come across as well, so that they're people connected actually with either a party in the case or other witnesses.
Huge thing. If you had a map of the territory, here be dragons on the map, because if you use a relative, one of the things you know about relatives is they have what would be awarenesses that you as an investigator or a lawyer will never have about what would be the family register, what would be the kinds of ways in which these are related. They will also know the narratives of the family. They will know that, in fact, certain things are taboo. They will not be mentioned. You shouldn't mention auntie so-and-so or uncle so-and-so, even though you know he's a perpetrator. So what you've got is it's so shot full of risk that as long as you recognize the risks, you do a risk assessment. I've got a briefing sheet, which I said, people are willing to have. And what I often say to when I'm training people to interview using interpreters is to say, use this briefing sheet. And within this briefing sheet, something which very often happens when relatives are interpreting, they have things which I call side conversations. You might ask the question of this individual, and you ask your question, the interpreter, the relative, says it in the target language. And then you hear this to and fro going on. You're there thinking, how do I manage this dialogue that's going on here? You have no idea what's being said, but they're talking family and they're talking dangerous issues and so on. And you are completely unaware of them. And the important issue is these dialogues, these side conversations have to be planned for beforehand. And you, if you brief the interpreter properly, you can come in and say, what's going on here? You can actually actively manage. And of course, that puts the relative on the back foot, quite rightly, to explain what's going on here. And what relatives tend to do if they're interpreting is hugely, the risk there is of editing what this person actually says.
Eric, there's one, we're getting through our time rapidly, and there's one last question that I want to ask of you, because at the time I was astonished. I had said that I had a forensic psychologist who was analyzing the witnesses and their interviews. And I invited the prosecutor to make it a joint instruction. So that
really, I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, and that's what the ICC wanted under our directions. And you know, I'm a compliant fellow.
A bit.
Judge says it, so I do it, and I did that with all our experts, and I offered that it be a joint instruction. And actually, it was turned away. It was said the judges are more than capable of deciding the quality of the interviews and the witnesses. To me, that was a big mistake. That was
Absolutely.
Yes. So perhaps elaborate on that a bit further. Why judges and lawyers, for that matter, we don't know everything, although we think we do, why this is so important, and maybe that will wind up this conversation.
Well, it is a lovely thing to round it off on, because I'm going to tell you something which probably at least will close down one line of employment for me, Stephen. I had the challenging task of being invited by the Judicial Studies Board to run a series of training events for judges on the issue of credibility. And I was provided with some video material of court procedures from Canada. And so I did my homework and so on, and then I duly went on this kind of roundabout of having many judges all assembling. They were the hardest people I've ever worked with, because they would nod and smile and be very kind of socially skilled. But it was perfectly obvious that, in fact, going back to where I entered this, judges suffer from conviction psychology. When they are convinced about something, hell and high water will not move them. Or if it is, you have to drag them kicking and screaming. And the number of times when we had, kind of little seminars, and I'd sit down and we'd look at this, and there'd always be eventually, after lots of nods and smiles, someone saying, well, we really know, when they're telling lies. And I said, really? I mean, I'd really like to know. Oh, well, we know. They said, well, I've been asking questions since 1964. And I don't think I'd ever assert without some kind of substantive analysis of content, whatever. No, we know the way they say it. And so I think, go back to this confirmation bias. What happens as you travel this career, and it's an understandable career, where you're exposed to all scraps of humanity, you see various repetition types of behavior, people managing themselves variously in the witness box, that it will build within one's belief that one is convinced when one sees a behavior. And the behavior, I think, that most judges go on is demeanor. So they look at a person's demeanor and say, he's lying, or that's the truth. So one of the most important things I tried to get across to them was that if a person gives a confident account that they're assured, then they could be supremely confidently wrong. And there you go. But indeed, what happens is that still within the system, if a person gives a confident account, people are disposed to believe them. I worry about that. In the case of R.V. Momadou and Limani in the Court of Appeal, this was when a detention centre, Yarlswood, was completely burned to the ground. There was a riot. and it was manned by G4 detention officers. And all of these detention officers were, after the event, taken in small groups to be having a debriefing on, it was supposed to be to help them understand. But what it did is it rehearsed them. So what would actually happen is that people would come in and give convergent accounts confidently. And what fell apart was one detention officer gave an entirely confident account of seeing something happening when he was on the wrong side of the door. He couldn't have seen it. But this whole notion of confidence came across. Anyway, so I've whittled on, hopefully not too much, but the important issue for me is judges are very hard to persuade. That in fact, it might be that their disposition to confirm in their own minds is that. And come back to the ICC, which I think is really important in international context, is I'm not at all surprised now you've told me all these years later that you generously and responsibly offered to do a joint analysis, that the OTP said no thanks, because what that would have to do is to shake the foundations and actually remove their conviction psychology.
Yeah, that's what I thought at the time as well. Eric, it's been a fascinating evening. We've done an hour and a half. I hope our audience have enjoyed it as much as I have. Discussing this I've just got a remark in from George, fascinating conversation. Thank you. So George has said it on my behalf. And it's been a pleasure to discuss these matters and understand from you as a psychologist who is an interviewing expert why psychology is so important in the matter. It's not just something that you pick up, the interviewing of witnesses. It's a much more subtle operation. And in my view, very, very important in getting to the truth of the cases that we have to deal with. Eric?
Can I come back just very fleetingly?
Sure.
I think you're such a dear fellow. I still look back, way back 2013, when you very kindly invited me to. We had an abortive attempt a couple of years before in Manchester, but it didn't work out or whatever. But the thing that really strikes me, and I wanted to say to you, Stephen, what really made me want to continue working with you is that what it seems to be almost within your blood is this notion that you're an understanding, encompassing kind of person, but you do see the role of the defense as very much carrying quality control of what would be prosecutor and investigator behavior and the way they think, not in an unkind way, but I think you are a beacon, and I don't want to embarrass you, but you're a beacon in as much that you, for me, and the chambers represent what is active defense. And I've written a lot boringly about active defense in police stations, but what really made me so pleased and proud to work with and for you was that I rubbed shoulders with defense lawyers who were there as watchdogs and quality control, and now you tell me you were trying to be welcoming, but I'm not at all surprised when they said, no thanks, mate.
Okay, Eric, on that note, we'll have to end. And great to see you. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us all.
As they say in Irish, God am a hugger.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye.
Take care.